Well, I am so happy to be here talking to you. I'm Christine Pride, the author of All the Men I've Loved Again, but I'm really excited about this book. It's basically a rom-com ripped from my own life about a woman who dates two men back to back in her 20s, and then she dates the same two men in her 40s, which is a pretty wild premise, I have to say, for a novel and for life.
I love that that is like that you already know that going into reading the book. I think that is one of the most exciting things about it, just because they're more and more, but for a long time there were so few books about women in their even like mid 30s, and I'm about to turn 40, so it was just delicious to like know that was
I love that. I
yeah.
mean, I think it is so important that, obviously, and this is, even coming from my background as a book editor for 20 years, I mean, you really want to meet all kinds of readers and all kinds of readers' experiences, right? And just like everything else in our culture, books tend to skew young, right? And that shouldn't be the case. There's obviously a lot of women on the eve of 40 and past 40 who are reading books, and I hope can relate to this story because it is very much a coming of age in two parts, and I do feel like we come of age in life multiple times, right? So there's kind of the obvious one of being in our teens and 20s and learning about the world and coming of age, and Cora, the main character in the book, does that. But I feel like there's this whole other coming of middle age almost, where you get to know yourself and meet yourself through a different lens of life experience, but still, feels like there's so much growth and discovery and surprise involved in that process too. So we never stop kind of growing and evolving.
I think you're so right. I remember when I was like, I think like 19, this woman was coming to help me install a floor in our like the place that I was renting in Atlanta. And she was like, I was complaining about whatever I was complaining about at the time, probably guys. And she was like, just wait till you're 35. Like it's gonna happen again. And I remembered that forever because I was just like, oh shit.
Was she coming to install your floors or was she a psychic or both?
Yeah. As I was approaching my like mid 30s, I really do feel that way. And I have this sort of totally not scientific theory that we have this like peri menopause thing that happens the same way that we do when we're teenagers. We like reawaken. I feel like that happens in this book in really delicious ways. Of course, like romantically and sexually, that's really cool and fun, but also just in like the reflections of self-awareness and what it means to be in relationship with friends.
I'm nodding my head effusively, especially about the peri menopause part, because, I mean, growth is growth, but I do think hormones are a huge factor in sort of, causing a lot of internal turmoil and tumult that actually, the same way with puberty. I think that like kind of I don't know, tumultuous resetting of kind of your inner equilibrium is both a difficult and destabilizing process, but it also, it's like as with puberty, you kind of have to get through it to get to the other side. And so I think even in writing this book, there is a lot of that going on for me, right, as the author. Like I think it comes out on the page when the writer himself or herself is wrestling with the issues that the character is wrestling with on the page. So I love that kind of alchemy in writing.
I listened to an interview from a few years ago with your co-author of one of your previous books, and you mentioned this book in that interview. And so I was going to ask, how long has it taken you to write this book? Like, what was that process like, and when did you decide to write it?
Right. God, what is time? Who knows? That's interesting because I have no idea when this interview was with Joe Piazza, my writing partner. As a sidebar, I'm taking a break from writing now because Joe and I have our third book due to our publisher tomorrow. So that's a real time update. But in terms of when I started writing All the Men I've Loved Again, I mean it's been a couple years now. I sold it 2 years ago, and then I think it was, about a year, a little over a year to write, and then another, 6 months or so for the editorial process. Um, it's, kind of the dirty little secret of publishing is that it like always takes so much longer than you think, right? Even taking aside the writing, which takes the time it takes, but just the publishing process, right? It takes a while to see a book on a bookstore shelf. But I think it's been about a 2-year journey all told.
You obviously have a ton of experience from the other side of publishing, so I wonder what it's, when did you make that transition to publishing your books with, I guess, were the first books that you published with Joe Piazza?
Yeah, so it's actually kind of a fun story in that I was still working at Simon and Schuster and I was publishing Joe's books. So I published her novel as her editor. And that process is very intimate in a way, right? When you're working with another writer, like, it's just there's a lot of togetherness over the course of working together on the book. And so from there, I had this idea, which as an editor, you're always having ideas in the back of your mind about what kinds of books you want to see in the world. Usually you don't think that you're going to write them yourself. But in this case, I did have an idea percolating about an interracial friendship that was upended by a police shooting that hits close to home. And so I went to Joe with this idea because as an editor, you're also looking for unique ways to tell a story, to shape a story, and to get attention for a story. And so I thought it would be a really interesting idea if we partnered together as a Black woman, which I am, and she's a white woman. And so we could have both our, kind of perspectives, our very distinct perspectives of, being in the world in our races and bodies, and bring that to bear in the story. And that book became We Are Not Like Them. And then we wrote another book together from there, before I ventured out on my own. So it's a little bit like a coming of age process, even as a writer, in that, there have been these steps along the way to, from editor to collaborative writer to now solo writer. So it's been an interesting journey.
I really like the way that race is treated here. I like laughed out loud about the comment about Lincoln when it was like even talk to like a toothless white guy.
Yeah.
So that's probably a guy related to me. And it's also funny because my husband is Dominican and we are able to like talk like that about things like that, especially when we're traveling together in the South where I'm from. It's just nice to be able to both read and experience that kind of like intimacy. So I'm really excited to read that book too because
Oh, good. Yeah. Especially as an interracial couple, I think you'll appreciate it. And what's great about those two books, Joe and I's first two books, and I hope, even All the Men I've Loved Again, though it's different territory, is it really can start and foster a lot of conversations about connection, right? Like there are different ways into it, but um, all of these books together are really concerned with friendship, right? With the ways we support each other, with family, with who becomes your family, right? So, when your friends become your family or when your romantic partner becomes your family, right? Our second book dealt with adoption. And so it's all the ways that we find these touch points, but also all of the, sort of fault lines and conflicts that can come up, the obstacles, right? That can sometimes impede these connections. And of course, some of them are the romantic cliches, but a lot of our work does have to deal with race, right? And how that can come up as a flashpoint. But I'm glad you found it entertaining because what I like to do in my work is show the softer side and the funnier side, right? And it's not just conflict, divisiveness, but it really is about how we find a way around conflict and divisiveness more than anything.
yeah, I really like that. And I like too that, because when I read it, I laughed and then I was like, I remembered this conversation that I had with my husband when we were driving through the South that was sort of like during a kind of when this is placed, like in 2021. And so, all this stuff is going on, the COVID, all the conflict. And he was like, you know, I'd like you to drive, and so because he was just I don't want to deal with cops while we're down here. And then when we were driving he was like, do you think any of these places would like not find me welcome? And we kind of made a joke about it, but it was like it's nice to have both. Like it's an entrance point, I think, like you're saying.
And it's real. I mean, I write a column for Cup of Joe periodically about race. And, in one of the columns, I shared a story of even in the 80s when I was a kid, my family was living in Alabama, my like extended family, my grandparents, and we were driving from Maryland down to meet them. And we pulled into a gas station at night that refused to serve us, I mean, this is the 80s. And so it was like a very fraught situation, I remember, not necessarily dangerous, right? I mean, there was no weapons involved or things like that, but just sort of a menacing, you need to get out of here. And really, as a child, reacting to my parents' unease about how they were going to handle this and understand. And that like when you consent as a kid, your parents are trying to protect you from something, and that's almost more unsettling, right? Because you're like, what do I need to be protected from? I wasn't, fully understanding everything about the situation at 5 or 6 or however old I was. But it's real, the travel thing, even in America and even today in 2025, is real. And now it's real for trans folks, trying to get around. And I mean, we could segue into another whole discussion.
One thing that I really loved about this is, like you said, like the evolution of friendships. I know that the location or the center of the book is on romantic relationships, but I was really enjoying, there are these 20-year long friendships too, and seeing how one, like the, three main friends are kind of like none of them have like a perfect life, which I really enjoyed because I feel like so much in books, it's like, oh, my friend got rich and is so happy and I'm not happy, or vice versa. And so it's like they're all dealing with conflicts, and seeing how the people who they were, became someone different than they expected to be was really interesting. And I loved that.
Oh my God. Well, do you have hours and hours? Because friendship is my favorite subject. And I like to think that this book is, as much as is a, classic hetero love story, right? It's also a love letter about friendships. And I even write a line in the book that's something like, a relationship is too much to take on alone. You need your friends. And I think, that's certainly true in my own life, where it's like, I have my relationship and I love my partner. And then I have my group chat, which is like an annotated version of my relationship. But that sounding board, is so important. And, I've been so lucky to have great lifelong friendships, from even first grade on, but definitely like solid college relationships. And so the two characters in the book, Nisha and Kim, that are friends with Cora in the same way, really inspired by that, right? They're sort of composite characters. For these friends, but also, it was really important to me to show the way that friendship changes your life and is so much a part of you becoming who you are. And your friends are witness to your life, and in that way, they shape it. And so, I mean, no spoilers, but I love to have the opportunity where when we fast forward to Cora, in her 40s, she has these people that remember her in her 20s and remember what happened in her 20s, so that they can advise and talk to her about it. And certainly you can make great friends, in your adult life that didn't know you then, but they wouldn't have been a witness to this, so they wouldn't, to what happened. So they just don't have the same level of, I don't know, information and credibility and an involvement, or remembering how the situation was different than you remember it even. In some cases rosier, in some cases not. But you need people like that to both serve that purpose of wisdom, but also to cheer you on, all along the way. And I think what I was really trying to show is how this trifecta of friends, cheered each other on through adulthood. And importantly, I like what you said, like none of their lives are perfect and their friendships aren't perfect. And so sometimes I do think as much as we glamorize romantic relationships in pop culture, sometimes we can glamorize friendships too. And so I was really trying to show that friendships take the same amount of work and there's the same amount of grievances and annoyances that pile up over the years that require, communication and forgiveness and grace. And so we wanted to see that play out on the page too through these female friendships.
I recently reconnected with an ex, like as friends, but I hadn't seen or talked to him in close to 20 years. And I did so with my
Oh,
best,
wow.
like met up in New Orleans where he lived, and we just like went out and, we're doing the New Orleans thing. And what I loved about this book is that also me and my friend were doing is just the amount of call outs and like jokes that you can make that are so layered with like the past experience. It's so fun. It's so fun to know people for a long
Yeah,
time.
it really is. Yeah, to have these memories and yeah, to have jokes that then have lasted, like inside jokes, that last so long. And it's such I mean, it seems minor, but I think they're really powerful touch points to keep connections between all the versions of ourselves, right? There's then this filament, this kind of thread that as much as you might change or as much as you might go through difficult experiences in life or grow, evolve, whatever the case, there is like kind of a through line, right? And these friendships, even if you separate and pick back up, they offer that like connection to hold on to, not only to remember your relationship and your friendship with that person, but to remember who you were when you were friends with that person and what you did and went through. It's very powerful.
I think that's so true. And that really shows through in the book, which is such like a human experience that we don't talk about very often, like remembering the past. I thought it was so funny because I had like a kind of love triangle when I was in high school, and I had my person who ended up being my boyfriend for a long time was an artist, and the other one was a lawyer who was super religious. And so I was reading this, I was like, that is so funny because it's so similar in so many ways. But
My
you know,
book is not just ripped from my life, it's ripped from your life too.
so
That's
I was
funny.
wondering, did you choose those, two different kinds of, I guess, career personality styles from your life, or what made you choose that?
I did, I mean, like I said, a lot of this is informed from my personal life. But it was really important to me to fictionalize, right? Like 90% of it, other than the like base premise. And so, especially since Cora is very different than me as a person, right? Where I'm like really extroverted, she's kind of shy and measured, and I mean we both have overthinking in common. Um, but in that way, I had to make her love interest different than my love interest in real life, because obviously you would be kind of attracted to different people or the vibe would be different. And so it was fun to create these male characters kind of out of whole cloth. And to your point, I did want to give them pursuits that felt organic to their personalities, right? So, what would they be interested in and what kind of life would they want to have? Um, and one thing, not to get too lofty about it, but one thing that I was trying to explore is your family background can make such a difference in that. And so, for the Lincoln character who had sort of a more difficult family background, his career is less important, though in the book he does become a lawyer. But it's about what is going to give him stability, right? So I think when we're making these choices as adolescents, we're making the choice of like, what kind of life do we want to have? And the Aaron character is much more of like, sort of self-proclaimed iconoclast or, sort of more unconventional type who would never imagine himself working in a corporate environment, right? And so when you're in your 20s and you're thinking about, okay, what kind of life do I want to have? Um, I think your job can sometimes fall in line with that, not vice versa, if that makes sense. And so, yeah, they do end up being obviously they're very different people. And I think one of the things that's fascinating to me is, sort of how do we choose people? Like, how do we choose who we're attracted to and the degree that that's not even a choice at all? There's something greater at work, I think, both scientifically in terms of like pheromones and chemistry, But also the heart can be really capricious, right? And there's really no reason that Cora should have fallen in love with two such different people. And yet, let alone twice. And yet, there she was having to navigate that. And I think there's a lot to think about there. And I'm hoping in book clubs, that will inspire people to really be thoughtful about, reminiscing about who they ended up with and why, and who they didn't end up with and why. Because I think that's just as fascinating.
I think you're so right. And I think that love triangles are just the coolest place to explore how we make these like really critical choices and how we also just stop making choices and that's a choice too, right? Like I feel like a lot of times when we're making like love-based choices, it's like we come to a point where we're just like, oh, I actually just know the answer. And it doesn't feel like a decision anymore. It feels like a falling, right? I think that's why we use that word like fall
Yep.
in love. It's just kind of we just surrender or something like that. And I love the way that that kind of plays out and doesn't play out at different times in the book. I think it's really really fun. And one thing I wanted to ask you is about how time exists in this book and like why you chose to put in the letters. I always like to like play with form in the things that I write, and so it makes me so happy when there are, there's a break and there's letters or, articles or anything like that.
Yes, I love letters. I actually have a dream of writing a full epistolary novel. Letters have been a component actually of all of the books that I've written. And I just gravitate toward it kind of naturally. And it's just to me such a romantic idea almost, or I get nostalgic for this time as a Gen Xer, where we didn't, I mean, I'm not a digital generation, right? So we wrote letters, mailed things, and it was lovely, I have to say. And it's gone now for the most part. An email or a text just doesn't hit the same way. But in real life, I wrote letters back and forth with my boyfriend at the time in my 20s. And it was a very special experience. And so I definitely wanted to capture that in the book. But I also thought it was a good way and a different way to get to know the character through, just their first person words, the character being Aaron in this case, and what he was saying to Cora and how what he was sharing. And that's, I feel like you just get to know somebody in a different way when they're like laying it out there in a more vulnerable way without an audience than you do if you're talking back and forth. And certainly as a reader, then, right? It's just different when you're reading a letter versus you're eavesdropping on a conversation. And so I just wanted to experiment with it. And I liked it. I liked finding Aaron's voice on the page.
There's like the linear narrative, and then we have the letter that kind of brings us into the future. And I love the tension there because at the time that the letter comes, it doesn't like seem like there's any way that another guy is going to enter Cora's life. And then you're sort of like, oh no, how are we going to get to this future point? And I love that we don't know. And I always get like stressed out when I know more than the characters. But it's
Yes, that's
like, oh, I go into the book knowing that there's going to be a love triangle. So it's like I only know that. And so I love how much we don't know. And it's just like it like creates this tension and mystery. It's such a great strategy.
fun fact, just like behind the scenes, because I'm sure a lot of your listeners are writers. I can't help but put my book editor hat on a lot to think about how many, conscious decisions and trial and error goes into structuring a book or figuring out how the story is going to play out. And so in an early version of this book, all the letters were from Cora to Aaron, which was interesting. And then it ended up being a lot of Cora, so I pulled back on that. But it was a fascinating exercise in that I essentially recreated then all of their correspondence, right? So in a way because, and this is why I always tell writers, no chapter or no attempt is wasted, right? Even if you write a whole scene and have to scrap it or the ending, right? And you're like, oh, that didn't work, but there's always going to be something about that that informs the rest of the book. So in this case, I think the letters from Aaron feel more real and deep because they're actually responses, to invisible letters that the reader doesn't see. But it's kind of like if you're eavesdropping on a phone call, right? When you hear the other side, even if you can't hear the other side, you have like a more realistic sense of what's happening if, someone is really talking.
So I can super relate to the letter thing because I still write letters. I love letters. I think that we should just all be pen pals.
Or just while we're in the subject of letters, I think it's so important to because our society is so fast now and it's so easy to just like zip off an email or zip off a text and it contributes to this go 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 nature. Even when you're trying to meaningfully connect with somebody, you're still doing it in kind of the in your mind the fastest most efficient way possible, like how was your lab test, or what was going on. And to some degree it's nice to be able to talk with people more in real time. There's definitely upside to that. But writing letters forces you to slow down. It forces you to actually think and be thoughtful about what you want to say and how the person's going to receive it. Even the act of writing, with a pen, takes more time and intentionality than typing. And so I don't know. Maybe if the book does anything, I would love it to be like an encouragement that everybody writes one letter to somebody, in 2025. The single biggest thing I think that I had to learn in making the switch from, wearing an editor hat to a writing hat is accepting the emotional component to it. I really underestimated how emotionally fraught writing a book is, on so many levels, like the discipline required and the second guessing and the will anything come of this and will people like it? And I don't think any writer is immune to that. But it is one of those experiences that you don't know what it's like until you do it, like marriage or motherhood or, these big shifts in your kind of even identity. And so, I think just sort of accepting that and understanding that that's just going to be a part of the process and that I'm probably going to cry at some point in every book in fatigue and frustration is and not beat myself up about that. I'm like, what are you doing? Like, be a professional. But I've just decided that the tears are a part of the process. Um, and so that since that's a lesson I learned, I try to pass that along, to not be so hard on yourself for all of the what I now understand to be sort of normal ups and downs, normal emotional ups and downs, and frustrations of the journey itself. I do see a wide audience for this book. I mean, because I do love that there are the age ranges, right? So I think younger women, women in their 20s who, like we talked about earlier, are really searching, right? For what their job is going to be, what their life is going to be like. And, we put such a big emphasis in our society on who your person is going to be, like who your romantic partner is going to be. And it causes a lot of stress for young women. I remember being one of them. And so I think they'll relate to Cora and that aspect, that it's, the high stakes and kind of finding yourself aspect. And I think that'll be nostalgic for women of a certain age looking back. And then, for women in their 40s and 50s and 60s beyond to sort of really identify and relate with the 40s Cora, who is facing all of the tapestry of issues, challenges, and triumphs of being in middle age, and the different kind of searching that comes in that phase in life, which is no less intense, but just hits a little bit differently. So I think, I think there's a lot for people to think about and talk about here. And one of my goals was to make kind of the nostalgia factor really high. I want people to want to remember their first love and their first friend and their college experience or their early adulthood, all those sorts of things. Because I think I don't know, I think that's nostalgia is a really powerful emotion. So this is Cora, our heroine, meeting her, or spotting, I should say, her future love interest, Lincoln, for the first time. Standing a few feet away, having materialized out of nowhere, was one of the most striking people Cora had ever seen. He stood out partly because he was so tall, at least 6'2", and partly because he was one of the only other brown faces around, but mainly because he was so hot. Cora's extensive vocabulary was a source of pride, but her addled brain couldn't come up with a more eloquent description for this stranger. She watched as he leaned over and dragged a sharp blade along the top of a large box at his feet. For whatever reason, this action played out in her mind in slow motion, such that she could see the subtle quivering of his forearm muscle as it flexed and released. When he stood back up, she zeroed in on the gold name tag attached to his bookstore uniform, Lincoln Ames. Cora whispered it a few times under her breath. Lincoln Ames, Lincoln Ames, Lincoln Ames. She hadn't considered that a name could be attractive, but it was, along with so much else about him. First, his skin. For this, she was able to summon just the right SAT word, luminous. Gore had only ever heard the term applied to women, and only in makeup commercials, but it was the perfect description. It was like someone had taken an ideal human form and poured the silkiest, smoothest dark chocolate over it. Everything about him was long. Each of his limbs stretched an extra inch beyond the factory model. His eyes were as jet black and shiny as piano keys. But it was his lips that nearly did her in, full, pillowy, and smooth, in a way that called to mind clouds and mangoes. These lips were responsible for sending Cora stumbling into the person in front of her, who'd been nodding aggressively along to whatever was playing on the Discman clipped to his jeans. Guys like Lincoln Ames didn't exist in Cora's world outside John Singleton movies or the imaginary crushes she conjured that were all some version of a young James Earl Jones she once saw in one of her father's vintage ebony magazines. Never in the flesh. It was as if she were in an elevator that had dropped too fast. There was a sudden, overwhelming wooziness and a warm heaviness deep within her, almost like vertigo, but not quite. What she was experiencing was, of course, attraction, but Cora Belle was so unfamiliar with the concept and sensation, it registered mainly as confusion. So now this is when Cora meets her other love interest, Aaron. They'd known each other for only 2 weeks. It didn't make sense. But neither did her reaction when she walked into the cafe they would agreed to meet at after she'd answered his Craigslist ad. Neither did the way thoughts of him infiltrated a securely walled off corner of her mind since then and made themselves quite comfortable. Coral had stumbled upon the post about a part-time gig organizing and digitizing photos late one night and thought, why not? It was a way to make cash, it was flexible, and it had the potential to fill the long, empty afternoons lined up like dominoes as far as the eye could see. Though she'd almost bailed on the interview. She couldn't find a place to park and was one more circle around the block away from giving up when a spot opened right in front of Busboys and Poets. Inside the Too Hip Cafe, she instantly spotted the green paisley shirt Aaron had said to look for to find him. How could she not? It was a blinding neon lime color. Except it didn't belong to the old white man she'd pictured from their messages, but a black guy maybe a few years older than her. Having to adjust this image in her mind wasn't what made her stop to collect herself at the hostess stand, though. It was the way her body felt, a hot, cold tingle, not unlike the first blush of a fever, as she watched him, the languid way he sat with one elegant hand draped over the back of his chair, legs crossed, as comfortable as a cat in the sun. He radiated a mellow, detached curiosity with an undertone of haughtiness that also reminded her of a cat. Not a house cat, though, a puma or a jaguar, watchful, smart, curious. But the most unsettling part was that she said one word under her breath, or maybe it was just so loud in her mind she thought she'd spoken it out loud. You.